Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are tackling something huge, World War I. Its origins, its consequences.
But we're not just doing a history lesson, are we?
No, absolutely not. We're treating this like a research project designed to sharpen your critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
How you evaluate global challenges.
That's the core idea, yeah. Inspired by the sources, our mission is to really get into the thick of the 20th century, look at its biggest disaster, World War I, and then peel back the layers, go deeper and deeper to find the oldest roots.
The causes of the causes, as the material puts it.
Exactly. And a key objective is bridging that gap, between the big academic histories and the actual lives people lived. Your ancestors, maybe. Their reality.
And that's where we're starting, isn't it? With a challenge for you, the listener, to ground this period, 1900 to 1918, in your own family history.
Yes, it's about making it tangible. The sources suggest looking into relatives who lived then, finding specific details, things that connect those big forces like industrialization to actual people.
So what kind of details are we talking about?
Well, it's about understanding their social reality. First, their job. What did they actually do for a living? Was it factory work? Farming? Service?
That connects directly to the economy of the time.
Right. And did they face economic hardship, unemployment, maybe debt, sudden price hikes? The kind of struggles that hit ordinary people.
And where they lived matters too, right? Not just the town, but the conditions.
Oh, definitely. The sources ask, was their neighborhood polluted, unhealthy, ugly? Think about the reality of early industrial cities, the smoke, the soot, the lack of proper sewage.
We talk about the Industrial Revolution as progress, but for many it meant, squalor, constant low-level crisis, poor sanitation, disease.
That was daily life for millions. And we should also look for signs of social breakdown. Loneliness, isolation, what the sources call atomization.
Like families being split up, people moving far away for work.
Precisely. Did those traditional support networks, family and friends, start to fray? It shows how massive economic shifts impact personal bonds. And crucially, were they caught up in political problems?
Wars, obviously, but also other things.
Yeah, violence, maybe prosecution, or even just living under foreign rule, like in a protectorate. It turns these big geopolitical events into verifiable personal experiences, possibly trauma.
So instead of fitting your relative into history, you're seeing how history shaped their actual life.
Exactly. It flips the perspective.
And I love this final touch from the sources, keeping an object from that relative. A watch, maybe a photo, a letter.
It's powerful, isn't it?
It really is. It acts as a physical link, a tangible connection between your analysis now and a life lived back then.
It's a reminder. These huge forces we're about to discuss, they weren't abstract concepts. They determined if that person ate, if they survived. It grounds the history.
Okay, so we have our mission, our personal connection point. Let's move into part one, defining this catastrophe. World War I, 1914 to 1918.
Right, and the first thing to understand is that it was, as the sources put it, a gigantic collective failure.
A failure of the world's most powerful nations.
The most industrialized, the most quote-unquote advanced. Nations driven by their industrial might, by the influence of big companies looking for markets, for resources.
They had the means to avoid it, but they didn't.
They convinced themselves war was necessary, maybe even inevitable. Destiny, some called it.
And the structure that allowed this failure was the alliance system.
Yes, these rigid blocks built up over decades. Before the war, you had the Triple Entente, that's the UK, France, and Russia.
Right.
And opposing them, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. It was an armed peace, basically. Any small crisis could potentially trigger the whole system.
Like a row of dominoes.
Pretty much. And when the trigger was pulled in 1914, the alliances shifted?
Italy didn't join its allies initially.
No, they stayed out at first, so the main wartime lineup became the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria.
Okay.
Against the Allies, which was the old Entente, plus Italy, who joined later, the USA eventually, and many others.
And Spain remained neutral.
Yes, Spain stayed out. No direct link to the Sarajevo trigger event, as the sources note.
And the way the war was fought, it immediately shows the dark side of industrialization.
Oh, absolutely. Industrialized killing on a scale never seen before. The trenches are the iconic image, aren't they? Mud, rats, disease, horrific conditions.
And defense became incredibly strong.
Which led to new, terrifying weapons to try and break the stalemate, like poison gas.
Used first by the Germans, then everyone.
Yes. Killing people as if it were insecticide, one source says, designed for terror, to bypass the trenches. Just awful.
And then tanks.
Tanks, right. Clumsy at first, but revolutionary. These huge metal machines.
And the name came from trying to hide them.
Yeah, the British code name during development was water tanks, supposedly for shipping water to keep it secret. They were the ultimate industrial product applied to warfare.
But amidst all that horror, there's this incredible moment, the Christmas truce of 1914.
It's an amazing story. Needs unpacking.
So soldiers just stopped fighting on Christmas.
Spontaneously, yeah. Along parts of the Western Front, French, British, German soldiers climbed out of their trenches on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, met in no man's land.
What did they do?
Shared food, exchanged little gifts buttons, cigarettes, sang carols together. Some sources even mention football matches.
Wow. It's like a moment of shared humanity breaking through.
Exactly. It showed these normal people, as the source puts it, recognized the absurdity of it all. They saw the humanity in their supposed enemy.
There's that quote from the soldier's letter.
Right. I don't want them to tell us of country, of honor. I call it carnage. It's a powerful rejection of the official narrative.
They almost stopped the war themselves.
It really feels like that, doesn't it? A moment where the will of the soldiers clashed directly with the orders from above.
So the orders won out.
Sadly, yes. The high command on both sides clamped down hard. Orders came down, resumed fighting immediately. Threats of court-martial, even execution for treason.
So they forced them back into the trenches.
They did. Rotated units, increased artillery fire to prevent it happening again. It's a stark lesson. The war machine wasn't sustained by popular enthusiasm necessarily, but by the rigid command structure enforcing it.
That structure faced huge challenges in 1917, though. A real turning point.
A massive one. Two huge events back-to-back, really.
First, the U.S. entry.
Yes. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking American ships. That brought the U.S. in. Fresh troops eventually, but immediately, massive industrial power and financial aid for the Allies. That tipped the balance.
And at the same time, Russia leaves.
Right. The Bolshevik Revolution happens, the Tsar is overthrown, the new socialist government signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers. A harsh peace, but it got Russia out.
Which freed up German troops for the West.
It did, but ultimately it wasn't enough to counter the influx of American resources and manpower. 1917 really sealed the fate of the Central Powers.
Okay, so we've mapped the conflict, the human cost, the turning points.
Yeah.
Now, to really understand it, we need the right tools, the historian's toolkit.
Yes, moving from the what happened to how we analyze it, the key goal here is crucial for critical thinking in general. Separating what we want to believe or what feels right emotionally from what the evidence actually shows.
Separating perception from reality.
Exactly. And the sources give us a great framework for this, distinguishing 3 types of ideas. It's easy to confuse them.
Okay, what are they?
First, scientific data. This is stuff you can measure, quantify, verify empirically. Like, this bottle holds 1 liter. That's data.
Checkable fact. Got it.
Second, philosophical argument or opinion. This is based on reasoning, values, interpretation. It's debatable, like saying, there's too much water in this bottle. That depends on context, needs, preferences. It's not simply measurable.
Okay, debatable, but not strictly factual.
Right. And third, religious belief. This is based on faith, tradition, shared identity. It's generally not up for empirical debate within its own system. The example given is, this is holy water. You can't prove or disprove that with a thermometer. It's a different kind of claim.
And mixing these up causes problems.
Big problems, especially in historical analysis. You need to know what kind of claim you're dealing with before you can even start evaluating it.
So once you identify the type of claim, how do you check if it's reliable?
The sources list key questions, basic critical thinking, really. Who wrote this? What's their reputation? Do they have a conflict of interest?
Like, are they paid by someone who benefits from a certain viewpoint?
Exactly. What's their actual expertise? Are they a researcher who studied this for years or just someone reporting an anecdote? Do they show their sources? Can you check their work?
And importantly, do other reliable sources agree?
That's a big one. Independent verification.
The example in the sources about the politician's hand gesture was pretty eliminating.
Right. The family member convinced it was proof of a conspiracy because of this triangle gesture on video.
Looked compelling in isolation, maybe.
But apply the toolkit. Are there other trustworthy sources? A quick check with reliable news outlets showed it was just part of an Olympic Games promotion imitating the Eiffel Tower.
So the conspiracy theory collapses under basic fact-checking.
Precisely. It helps you avoid getting sucked into narratives that sound plausible but have no real evidence.
But finding evidence isn't the whole story. History isn't bias-free.
No source is, no person is. The goal isn't to find some mythical objective source. It's to detect and understand the biases that are always present.
How do we do that? What tools can we use?
Narrative analysis helps a lot. First, look at the subject or focus. Who's the main character of the story? Is it a nation, a family, an individual? And how are they portrayed?
Like, is the story praising Spain's history or criticizing it?
Exactly. That choice of focus and tone reveals a bias. Then look at the setting. How is the environment described?
Words like terrifying or mysterious.
Yeah, emotionally loaded language shakes your perception. Or in videos, the music. A soundtrack can create a feeling completely separate from the facts being presented.
Sneaky. What else?
Focus and rhythm. What gets the most attention? Most words, most time. What ideas get repeated?
So if a historian spends ages on economic stats, but barely mentions social impact.
You know where their priorities lie. Their bias is toward economic factors. The order matters too. What comes first often seems most important.
Okay. And the last tool was hypertext. That sounds a bit complex.
It's about context, really. How does this particular story relate to other similar stories? Does it follow the usual pattern or does it break the rules?
Can you give an example?
Sure. Remember that example of the history professor? Let's say year after year, they spend 30% of their course on military history, heroes, battles, etc. That's their established pattern, their text.
Okay.
But then one year, maybe there's a big international crisis, they suddenly only spend 10% on military stuff and focus way more on, say, peace movements or social dissent.
So the change from their usual pattern is the hypertext clue.
Exactly. That deviation signals a shift in their focus, maybe their bias, perhaps reacting to current events. Recognizing that change in the structure of the narrative helps you analyze why it changed.
That makes sense. Okay, let's apply these tools to something concrete. WW1 propaganda posters. Governments were definitely using bias there.
Oh, massively. Take the simple nationalist appeals. Posters trying to recruit soldiers, especially from rural areas,
How do they work?
often by showing the nation as this perfect, peaceful countryside. Green fields, happy families. The bias connects the complex, faraway war to the very immediate emotional idea of defending your home, your land, even if the reality was far removed.
Clever. And then there's the really nasty stuff, dehumanization.
Yeah, like that infamous poster showing a German soldier as an ape, a simian brute carrying off a woman.
That's just pure racism.
Absolutely. The bias frames the enemy as non-human, as monstrous. If they're animals, you don't need to reason with them, you just need to destroy them. It justifies extreme violence.
Chilling. Were religious biases used too?
Very much so, especially
Yeah.
in places like Russia. Posters often use Christian imagery, St. George slaying a dragon, where the dragon represents the enemy leaders destroying holy places.
So the war becomes a holy crusade.
Exactly. It taps into deep religious faith, framing it as defending orthodoxy or Catholicism, not just fighting a political war.
And finally, appeals to older ideas, like loyalty to a king.
Yeah, slogans like God Save the King. That appeals to pre-capitalist ideas of duty, of serving your monarch almost unquestioningly. It bypasses rational arguments about the war's aims or costs.
Looking at these posters now, it's striking how blatant some of the appeals are.
Isn't it? It really shows how much ideologies and what counts as common sense can change in just a century. Arguments based on overt racism or unquestioning monarchical duty were mainstream then. Today, thankfully, most people would see right through them. It shows a massive shift in our baseline assumptions.
Okay, equipped with these analytical tools, let's turn to the consequences of the war. How do we categorize the damage?
The sources suggest breaking it down: political, economic, social, ideological, and demographic consequences. It helps grasp the sheer scale.
Let's start with political. What changed?
Hugely significant changes. First, the end of European dominance on the world stage. Their global hegemony was broken.
And empires collapsed.
Yes, the old dynasties fell. The Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary, the Romanovs in Russia, gone. The map of Europe was redrawn.
But there were some positive political shifts towards democracy.
There were. Driven partly by the war effort and the revolutions it sparked, many countries moved towards universal male suffrage, and critically, women gained the vote in many places, partly in recognition of their wartime contributions.
Okay, what about the economic fallout?
Devastating. Widespread crisis, massive material losses, farms destroyed, factories ruined or needing reconversion, huge national debts.
And the role of the state changed.
Significantly. To win the war, states took unprecedented control over their economies, rationing, price controls, directing industries. This set a precedent for much greater government intervention in the economy, even in peacetime, a lasting legacy.
And the human cost, demographics.
The numbers are just staggering. Around 9 million soldiers and civilians killed, but also 21 million wounded or permanently disabled.
That's a whole generation scarred.
Absolutely. Think of the social impact: millions facing lifelong injury, often poverty, without adequate support systems.
And ideologically, how did the war change how people thought?
It caused a major split. On one hand, you saw the rise of liberal pacifism, strong anti-war movements, people who'd seen the horror and just said, never again.
But there was an opposite reaction too.
Yes, a dangerous rise in revanchism, the desire for revenge, especially in countries that felt defeated or cheated, like Germany, the belief that territory needed to be reclaimed, that the war wasn't truly lost, but somehow betrayed.
But you can see that tension clearly in the peace process, can't you? Wilson versus Versailles.
Perfectly. You had U.S. President Wilson's 14 points pushing for justice, self-determination for nations, trying to build a lasting peace. Very idealistic.
Versus
The Treaty of Versailles, driven largely by French and British desires to punish Germany. It focused heavily on German guilt.
the infamous War Guild Clause.
Article 231, yes, forcing Germany to accept blame for all the loss and damage. And Article 232 demanding massive reparations for civilian damage.
So idealism versus punishment.
And the punitive approach arguably sowed the seeds for future resentment and conflict. A very unstable foundation.
Okay, consequences mapped. Now let's go deeper. The causes. We need to look beyond the immediate trigger.
Absolutely. The sources encourage a tiered approach: short-term, long-term, and very long-term causes.
So the short-term cause is the obvious one.
Yeah, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo, June 1914, by a Serbian nationalist. And then the failure of diplomacy in the weeks after the July crisis. Ultimatums, mobilizations. The whole system spiraled out of control.
But that's just the spark. What about the long-term causes? The fuel.
That's the period sometimes called the Armed Peace, roughly 1871 to 1914. This era was defined by several interacting factors.
Like what?
Intense nationalism, each country believing in its own superiority, its destiny, deep economic rivalries, especially Britain and France versus the rising industrial power of Germany, competition for markets, resources.
And colonialism played a role.
A huge role. Constant clashes over colonies in Africa and Asia, the scramble for Africa. It wasn't just about resources, it was about prestige, national power.
And all this led to
The creation of those rigid military alliance systems we mentioned earlier, the Triple Entente versus the Triple Alliance. It created a situation where war was almost seen as inevitable, a tool of policy.
and Spain's role here. Still peripheral.
At this long-term level, yes. Spain wasn't a major player in the central rivalries or the alliance systems driving towards the 1914 conflict. Its influence, the sources suggest, lies further back.
Which brings us to the very long-term causes. And this requires shifting our perspective on time itself.
Exactly. We need to grasp the shifting baseline concept. Humans, Homo sapiens, have been around for maybe 300,000 years, states. Only the last 5,000 or so.
And the Industrial Revolution.
Barely 250 years old. So those long-term causes we just discussed, nationalism, alliances, they're actually quite recent in the grand scheme of human history.
So what created the conditions for those things to lead to such catastrophe? What are the truly deep roots?
The sources point to two fundamental, very long-term drivers. First, the incredible, almost insane level of technology achieved during the Industrial Revolution, roughly 1780 onwards.
The machines, the factories, the weapons.
Yes, that technological capacity provided the means for warfare on that scale, the production, the logistics, the killing power.
And the second driver.
The specific world order built by these industrial nations. Capitalism as the economic system, and classic liberalism as the dominant political ideology.
Okay, let's define those. Capitalism.
Basically, an economic system where private businesses aim for profit and growth, and the state's role is primarily to protect private property and enforce contracts.
And classic liberalism.
A political ideology focused on individual freedom, speech, religion, etc., and minimizing state intervention in the economy. But, and this is crucial, the sources note it was historically weak at criticizing economic power. It focused on political rights, but tended to overlook or even protect the growing power and inequality generated by industrial capitalism. It served the interests of the rising business class, the bourgeoisie.
And for this capitalist liberal order to even exist, the sources say it needed three core historical ingredients, things we might take for granted now.
Yes, three pillars that aren't necessarily natural but were constructed over time. First, the modern state.
Why is the state essential for capitalism?
Because capitalism needs stability and predictability. The state provides the monopoly on violence, police, army, and the bureaucracy laws, courts, to enforce contracts, protect property, and regulate markets. Without the state, it's chaos, no secure basis for investment or profit.
Okay, pillar one, the state. What's second?
Private property, specifically the concept derived from ancient Roman law dominium, the idea that an object belongs absolutely to an individual owner who can use it, sell it, even destroy it.
How is that different from just owning things?
It's different from how many earlier societies viewed resources. Personal items might be yours, but major resources like land, water, forests were often seen as communal, shared, managed collectively. Roman law really solidified the idea of absolute private ownership, especially of land and capital.
And that allowed for?
The massive accumulation of wealth in private hands, which is the engine of capitalism and the source of those economic rivalries that fueled the war.
Right. State, private property. What's the third pillar?
Patriarchy, a system deeply embedded for perhaps 5,000 years in Europe that fundamentally values traditionally male activities, production, conquest, trade over traditionally female reproductive labor.
Like childcare, housework, caring for the sick and elderly.
Exactly. All the essential work that maintains the home, the community, and regenerates the workforce itself. Patriarchy systematically devalued this unpaid labor, making it invisible in economic terms.
How does that connect to capitalism and war?
By not accounting for the true cost of reproducing and maintaining the workforce, capitalism could pursue relentless growth and profit maximization. It externalized those costs onto families, primarily women. This created the conditions for rapid, often exploitative industrial expansion. Patriarchy provided the underlying social structure that allowed industrial capitalism to boom, leading eventually to the clash over resources and markets in 1914.
Wow. State, private property, patriarchy. Deep roots indeed.
So if these structures are still largely with us, how do they connect to tensions today in 2024? Let's start with imperialism.
Right. Imperialism extending power over other territories and peoples, whether military, political, or economic, was the logical outcome of industrial capitalism needing new markets, resources, and cheap labor.
The 19th century saw a huge wave of this.
Absolutely. The European powers carving up Africa, the Opium Wars forcing China open, the brutal exploitation of places like the Belgian Congo. It was driven by industrial needs and national prestige.
And it had horrific consequences even then. Terrible atrocities, things like the Armenian genocide under the Ottomans or the Irish famine, made worse by British political and economic policies. This history of exploitation and violence is the backdrop.
So the question for today is, does imperialism continue, just in different forms?
That's the open question the sources raise. Maybe less direct colonial rule, but perhaps new forms of economic control, debt dependency, the global reach of multinational corporations. Is the underlying dynamic of powerful nations extending influence over weaker ones still happening? It's something we need to constantly evaluate.
Okay, let's use those very long-term causes, technology, capitalism's expansion, to look at specific friction points in society today that echo the pre-1914 era. First up, false meritocracy.
Yes, falsa meritocracia. The sources use the example of Spain's 1857 Moyana law. It basically created two tracks in education based purely on money. If your family could afford the fees for the long baccalaureate around age 10, you were on track for university professions. If not, you got minimal basic schooling, just enough to be literate, maybe, and were destined for manual labor. No way to cross over.
So merit had nothing to do with it. It was about wealth.
Precisely. And the frustration comes when society tells you success is based on talent and hard work. But the reality is that the system is heavily weighted towards inherited advantage.
Does that inequality persist today? That feeling of a rigged system?
I think many would argue it does, in different ways perhaps. Unequal school funding, barriers to higher education, the importance of social networks. If those deep structural inequalities remain, they breed resentment and instability, just like they did before 1914.
Next friction point. The ecological crisis. How is that rooted in these long-term causes?
It's a direct result of the Industrial Revolution's technology combined with capitalism's relentless drive for growth, which doesn't easily account for environmental costs.
This isn't a new realization, is it?
Not at all. The sources mention a 1938 paper by G.S. Callender. Even then, he'd calculated that humans had added maybe 150 billion tons of CO2 to the atmosphere since the late 19th century and predicted the resulting temperature increase quite accurately.
Wow, 1938.
Yeah. And we have biological examples too, like the peppered moth in Britain during the Industrial Revolution.
The moths changed color.
Yes. The coal soot blackened the trees, so the light-colored moths became easy prey for birds. The naturally occurring dark variant, which was rare before, suddenly had camouflage. It thrived and became the dominant form. It shows that industry doesn't just pollute, it actively reshapes the environment at a biological level.
A stark illustration. Okay, next. Proletarianization and alienation.
This refers to the condition of the industrial working class. The source uses that quote from Benjamin Disraeli back in 1845.
What did he observe?
He painted a bleak picture. A man works 14 hours in a factory, comes home exhausted to find his wife is also exhausted from her factory job. The hearth is cold, there's no real meal. Disraeli says under these conditions, domestic life is a condition impossible to be realized.
The basic structure of family life breaks down.
Right. And what fills the gap? Disraeli noted workers spent their little free time and money in beer shops. Commercialized, often unhealthy, leisure replaces community and family connection. This leads straight into the next point, atomization.
Meaning increasing loneliness and isolation.
Yes, especially in the rapidly growing cities. People detached from their traditional roots, their villages, their extended families. The source uses that painting by Ramon Casas, Madeleine at the Moulin de la Galette.
What does it show?
A young woman, identified as a laundry worker, sitting alone in a bar in Paris, drinking, smoking. She looks completely isolated, adrift, a symbol of that urban loneliness.
And the connection to wider problems.
When people lack strong community ties, they might seek belonging elsewhere. They might spend money on fleeting pleasures, drinking, consumerism to fill the void. But this isolation can also make people more vulnerable, perhaps more susceptible to ideologies or political movements that promise unity, identity, a sense of belonging, even potentially dangerous ones, like the extreme nationalism we saw before 1914.
So false meritocracy, ecological crisis, alienation, atomization, all traceable back to those deep structures of technology and expanding capitalism.
They're like the modern symptoms of the conditions that led to the 1914 catastrophe. The patterns echo.
This has been, well, a really deep dive. We've gone from personal family stories right into the trenches, through the historian's toolkit.
And all the way back centuries to the foundations of the modern state, private property, and patriarchy as enablers of the system that produced WWI.
The big takeaway, then, seems to be that understanding today's global tensions, the conflicts, the rivalries, the crises, requires looking beyond the immediate headlines.
Absolutely. We need to see the short-term events as symptoms, often, of these much larger, slower-moving forces. Those tectonic plates of economic systems, political ideologies, and technological change that have been shifting for centuries.
The rivalries of 1914 weren't just about that specific moment.
No, they were the culmination of forces set in motion long before, enabled by those core ingredients, the state, private property, patriarchy, which allowed for that specific kind of industrial, capitalist, expansionist world order.
And we have to remember, those ingredients weren't the human norm for most of our 300,000-year history. They were specific historical developments.
Developments that created a baseline where endless growth seems normal, where care work is devalued, where resources are primarily commodities.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener.
If we've learned to identify the very long-term causes of the 1914 conflict, rooted in assumptions and structures built centuries ago.
What assumptions, what structures, what new technologies are we building or normalizing today? Think about AI, global finance, our relationship with the environment.
What forces are we setting in motion now that future historians might look back on and identify as the very long-term causes of their era's conflicts and crises?
The baseline is always shifting. What feels normal to us now might seem profoundly unnatural, even dangerous to future generations. What unquestioned assumptions are we living by today? That's something to think about.